Morning or good evening from wherever you are, and welcome to day 3 of Paraguay Speaks 2021. I am Vanessa Crico, a board member of the Paraguayan Student Association at the University of Melbourne. Before we begin, I would like to show my respect and acknowledge the traditional owners of the land of elders past, present, and emerging, on which this meeting is taking place. It is a pleasure to welcome such a diverse audience from around the world. Please note that this event is being recorded, so you can later revisit it through our YouTube channel. You can also join the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag #PYSpeaks2021. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you to our host for today, Freg J. Stokes. Freg is a writer, performer, and map maker from Melbourne, Australia. He is a PhD candidate in history at the University of Melbourne. His doctoral thesis provides part of the research basis for the Hummingbird Atlas. He has also worked on applied theater and public art projects in Australia, Brazil, and Bhutan. Freg has previously participated in our Paraguay Speaks event in 2019, and we are thrilled to have him today as host, monitoring questions and comments from our audience. I invite the audience to use the Q&A function on Zoom for questions and comments. We want to hear from you. Please don't be shy. Also, please feel free to add questions and comments in Spanish if you wish. Thank you, Freg, for joining us today. Good morning.
Morning, Vanessa. Thanks for having me here. It's great to be back at the conference after 2 years, and good to see that it's all happening once again. So today's talk is going to be, the talk happening right now at 10 is going to be given by Andrew Harvey. Professor Andrew Harvey is Executive Director of Student Equity and Director of the Centre for Higher Education Equity and Diversity Research, known as CHEEDR, at Trobe University. Andrew has published widely in areas of higher education policy, including issues of access, retention, regionality, comparative international admissions frameworks, employability, and the experience of foster care students. Other research interests include nationalism, identity, and Latin American culture, which is what we'll be hearing more about today. Andrew co-edited a scholarly book on student equity called Student Equity in Australian Higher Education, 25 Years of a Fair Chance for All. It's published by Springer in 2016. So we'll be hearing about the very interesting and odd colony of New Australia in Paraguay today from Andrew, and I'll hand it over. We'll be hearing about that for about 40 minutes, and then we'll be having questions, and I'll be moderating questions at the end as well. So thanks, Andrew.
Thanks, Freg, and I would also like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're situated here in Australia, and no doubt in Paraguay as well, for those joining us from afar. Thanks also to Vanessa and to the Association for the invitation. I want to make very clear at the outset that although I am a professor, it is not in any field related to this topic today. I am really a dilettante who is interested in this area, and I'll be sharing my own thoughts, but please do not think that they're coming from an historical expert in this space, and I'm sure there are people here who know a lot more about this area than me. Having said that, hopefully it's still interesting, and I'll be giving probably a fairly broad-ranging presentation today, which, although focused on New Australia, is really trying to look at some broader questions too around history and identity, how we remember things, why we remember things, and how we define ourselves. So with that, I'll start sharing the presentation. So, Sorry, we'll get there. If this doesn't work, it's not a crisis. It's not the most exciting PowerPoint you've ever seen. But it will go better from the beginning. Smooth as silk. This is the topic of the talk today, history, identity and autonomy. Legacies of the Australian settlement in Paraguay, although, as I said, it will be a little bit broader, hopefully, than just that. The couple of quotes here that I think are interesting in terms of framing this conversation. The first is by an author, Mikhail Bulgakov, that you may have heard of. A brilliant author who wrote The Master and Margarita during the Soviet era. And a lot of Soviet authors in those times had to describe the world that they saw through metaphor and allegories and fantasy, which is a lot of what Bulgakov ended up doing. But one of his famous quotes was, "Manuscripts don't burn." And it was at a time, of course, when a lot of manuscripts were being burnt. And it's an interesting reflection on the way that history survives despite attempts to extinguish it. And the other quote you'll see is, it's an epigraph on many famous books. "The past is never dead, it is not even past." That's William Faulkner talking about the southern US and history of slavery and civil war. But it's being taken in much broader context, of course. So you'll see that quote very often if you haven't already seen it very often. But again, it's quite insightful, I think, in terms of the way that we connect the past, present and future. And one of the things I think is interesting about the New Australia experiment and a lot of other settlements historically is that link between past, present and future and continuity of identity. And I'll talk a bit about that at the end. That is a picture of a whale, but it's also a picture of whales in a way. That's taken at Puerto Madryn, which was the first port that the Welsh settlers arrived in Patagonia in 1865. About 150 Welsh settlers came in 1865 and settled on the east coast of Patagonia. And they stayed in the caves that are just behind the tail of the whale. You can see there, that was their first accommodation, if you like, in Wales. They set up a settlement which struggled for many years, but which survived. And some of them ended up going west as well, out to the edge of the Andes, to a place called Trevelin, which is where my backdrop actually comes from. And there's now 50,000 descendants of Wales in Patagonia and about 5,000 Welsh speakers. And one of the things and I came to this through my own PhD, which was on nationalism in the United Kingdom. So I was looking at Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland and comparing those three types of nationalisms, and came across this settlement. And one of the things that interests me is the way that this settlement has continued in a way that New Australia clearly hasn't, to the same extent at all. So that now the Welsh government funds a range of exchange programs every year for people from Patagonia, Argentinians, to go to Wales to learn the language and to study, and also for Welsh teachers to come out every year to Patagonia to teach the language and history of Wales as well. And it's a significant amount of money. That when I was in Patagonia, I came across one or two of the teachers who were out there on exchange, and also some people who were studying Welsh who had never been to Wales. So Argentinians who had decided to learn Welsh because of the history of the town, and Trevelin in particular. And so this is the first Welsh tea house in Patagonia. I think this is in Guyman, one of the East Coast towns. So you see these kind of weird historical links, which to this day the Welsh government spends some time and money on. So in a way, this provides a bit of a comparison to what happened in Paraguay, but it's also connected because one of the reasons that the Australians went to Paraguay was because the Welsh had taken the land in Chubut, and so they didn't see potential to set up there. So they went to Paraguay instead. This is a pretty corny picture of the only real sign that I could find anyway that says "Welcome to New Australia." The town is now called Nueva Londres, London, and the main sign there now has the Paraguayan flag, the British flag, and the Australian flag together, and reflects the history of this particular town. The guy on the right there that you can see is Roddy Wood, and Roddy is one of the descendants of the settlement and was very helpful to me in my travels and has been very helpful to others I know. He's one of the main people involved with keeping this memory and way of life alive, based in Asunción. My own entry into this was when I was on the border of Argentina and Paraguay in Posadas. We came across the border to Encarnacion, and I just started asking some people some questions about it, whether anyone knew anything about New Australia. And somebody put me on to Alcides Wood, who was based in Encarnacion at the time, and he put me on to Roddy in Asunción, and away we went. So Roddy was a guide in some ways for me in my time in Paraguay, talking me through the settlement. Originally in 1893, about 200 Australians came across on the Royal Tar, led by William Lane, who was a firebrand, if you like. The context, obviously, at the time in Australia was a couple of things of note. One, the White Australia policy was forming, and Australia was becoming quite virulently racist, and part of that around labourers from the Pacific who were working in Queensland, and a range of other global reasons as well. And at the same time, you had the rise of the trade union movement in Australia too, but you had conflicts between labour and capital that became very heated around this time. So a lot of Australians were quite radical, and William Lane had thought about trying to establish a settlement within Australia, but eventually decided that that was not feasible and that they'd be better to move somewhere else to establish a utopian settlement. They were delayed for some time. They were assisted, I think, by the financial support of Mary Gilmore, who was one of the people who subsequently came out. And they set off on the Royal Tar and arrived in 1893, at which point, as I said, the Welsh had already established quite a strong foothold in Patagonia. I'm sure you all know the history of Paraguay at that time. We're talking just after the Triple Alliance. So both, I think, in Argentina and Paraguay, there was a desire on the part of the governments to populate the land. And obviously it had a hollowing out in Paraguay of particularly the male population. Having said that, the settlement itself was explicitly designed not to mix with the locals. The principles of the settlement were teetotalism was one of the key principles, English speaking was another, communism or socialism, let's not get into that debate, but shared ownership of land and lifelong marriage, as I said, without any mixing with the locals, and so quite a racist policy as well. And I think part of the reason why this episode is neglected relates to the way it's perceived historically. But of course, at the time, it was very much a product of its times and of its own history. The settlement split pretty quickly. There are a very small minority of women at the settlement. The majority were men, many single. They struggled with the rules that William Lane had set out. So the settlement split between New Australia and Cosme, which is about 80 kilometres from New Australia. So William Lane and others went to Cosme, which still has a few remnants of Australianness, not a lot. On my trip, I would say there is a cricket pitch there. There was talk of naming a school after Mary Gilmore. I'm not sure if that happened or not, but not a lot of a physical footprint other than still a few familiar surnames, such as Wood. They also tried to write and document their experiences. There was the Cosme Monthly and the Cosme Evening Notes, which Mary Gilmore edited for some time, which is available through the National Library and provides a bit of insight into the way the colony was going. That the episodes are not very long because the settlement obviously didn't last very long before it morphed into something else, and pretty quickly the settlers did start to marry local Paraguayans, and the nature of the settlement changed, and the privatisation of land happened within about 5 years of the initial settlement at New Australia. So what started as a grand utopian socialist settlement quickly changed, but nevertheless, there's now about 2,000 descendants of that original settlement, which I've seen referred to as, I've seen the descendants referred to as para-Australians, and that's probably how I've referred to them as well. But it strikes me that's not really the right term. They're probably more Australian Paraguayans in terms of being within Paraguay, but we have these conversations quite often with my wife, who's Mexican-American, or Guatemexican-American. Her mother's Guatemalan, her father's third-generation Mexican-American, and it's interesting what justifies the hyphenation of an identity, I guess. My father's New Zealand, but I would never describe myself as New Zealand Australian. But that whole identity in terms of the way hyphens in particular are used, I think is quite an interesting insight into the way that nationalities and people define themselves. And, you know, typically there's both a cultural and a power element at play, I think, in some of those cases, but every country differs, of course. I wanted to just run you past another couple of quotes here. So I mentioned that one of the reasons I think we don't want to remember this story is that it's considered a failure, and that its ideals are not ideals that we would hold now. There are two main books on the New Australia settlement. One is by Gavin Souter, the first one in 1968, called The Peculiar People. I'll have these references at the end. And another is Paradise Mislaid by Anne Whitehead, which is a very comprehensive analysis of the settlement. The other book that's of interest, which was one of the books that was an inspiration to the settlers, it's called Looking Backward. It's called Looking Backward 2000 to 1887. It's by Edward Bellamy. It was the second book in the US to sell 1 million copies, apparently, the first being Uncle Tom's Cabin. So it was a very popular book at the time, and it described from the position of a glorious future, if you like, a socialist future, how that path was reached from 1887, where a sort of Dickensian capitalist model was outlined. So it's a slightly different take on a utopian novel, but it was one that held a lot of power and influence, including to the Australians who set up to Paraguay. So the 19th century was full of utopias, of course. Another one of them in Paraguay itself was Nueva Germania, New Germany, which was Nietzsche's sister, and a guy called Bernhard Förster, who tried to establish a German fatherland there. Again, a failure in terms of the settlement, and really a pretty horrific anti-Semitic premise. But notable that Paraguay has often been described as a country of utopias, and I'm sure others will have more insight into that than I do. But you certainly see evidence of quite interesting migrant stories in Paraguay. And I remember staying at La Colmena, which is a Japanese town, and there's a Swiss settlement, I think, Villa Elisa, somewhere near Asunción. So there's Swedish, sorry. There's a whole lot of interesting historical places in Paraguay, of course. Now, the second quote here from the son of Leon Cadogan, probably the most famous descendant of the settlement, talks about how his father was proud of coming from the Australian socialist traditions, but was really a true Paraguayan. And interesting quote that over a long period, nobody will remember William Lane and the Australian colony here. Leon Cadogan's work with the Indians will be remembered far longer. I'll come back to that later. But well, perhaps just to stay on that for a little bit, Leon Cadogan's work was quite pivotal to translating Warani language and mythology, particularly for certain groups. His famous text, Ivu Rapita, and I'm sure I'm pronouncing that wrong, but apologies, was one of the keys to unlocking mythology and language. And he spent a lot of his life, most of his life, really defending the place of Indians, as he referred to them, within Paraguay. And so he became really this defender of Indigenous people in a way that was quite interesting in terms of the contrast with his own mother, who was a staunch and quite prominent feminist, but also very much a proponent of white Australia policy as well. So while she was, Rose Cadogan was very much a champion of the working class and somebody who supported a lot of people, she also had very strong race notions that were completely contradictory, really, to what her son spent the rest of his life trying to defend. So this, I think, hits at one of the obvious contradictions and paradoxes around identity and continuity of identity. But Leon Cadogan's been described as one of the 100 most prominent Paraguayans of all time, but I'm sure nobody in Australia pretty much would have heard of him. So while he's become very famous over there, he's not had the same impact here, which you would expect for somebody who's had such an important role in a country like Paraguay. This is a quote. This is a poem from Mary Cameron at the time, who then became Mary Gilmore. Mary Gilmore is a very famous Australian writer, but again, probably not many people know her work specifically. I thought I'd include this poem just for, there's a bit of context behind it as well, but just so you would have a sense of some of the things that she wrote and the style that she wrote. It's called We Missed Each Other. Somehow we missed each other, passed each other by unknowing. I who sought you, you who sought me, with hearts that throbbed to hopes and fears, passed each other in the early going, missed each other in the early years. Somehow we missed each other, we poor bankrupt souls, thus sowing a harvest that we rock not of. Now, others' sorrows claim our tears, others call us in our later going, others hold us in our later years. It was written in 1899, and it's written about Dave Stevenson, who is the cousin of Robert Louis Stevenson of Treasure Island fame. Mary Cameron at the time was very close to Henry Lawson, and also close to Dave Stevenson. She came out, not originally, she came out a couple of years after the original settlers had arrived. And this poem is about that fact, basically, that she missed Dave Stevenson on that trip to Paraguay, and they ended up going different ways. But she stayed in touch with Henry Lawson in particular throughout his life and was very close to him. So she was very connected into that world of Australianness, if you like, and Henry Lawson, of course, being one of really two poets who defined Australia to the popular masses. And I'll come back to her, but she, again, was a passionate believer in Indigenous rights and social justice, and never described the settlement as a failure. She was always keen to defend her time there and the settlement itself. The final one is just, again, this is a cousin, I think, of Roddy's, Roddy Wood, who, familiar with Paraguay or you're into comic strips, you probably know he's very famous as well. Has a park named after him in Kazapar, I think. But another interesting descendant of the settlement, who again, I'm sure has very little prominence in Australia, but is quite popular in Europe and throughout Latin America. So there are all of these descendants who have left different marks, some of whom probably don't want to refer or wouldn't want to refer to their time even in Paraguay necessarily with that settlement, with the Australian settlement, but who nevertheless came from that settlement and then ventured off to create lives in Paraguay and beyond. This quote is from Gerald Murnane from a story called The Battle of the Costa New, which I'm sure you're familiar with. The story itself is a fictional work, and it's about a Paraguayan imagining that he wants to come back to Australia and believing he's Australian, but never having been there. And the quote, "We yearn for Australia, but we dared not travel towards it for fear of finding it different entirely from our family's scant traditions and our own later conjectures." Again, is an interesting take on imagination and the way that we perceive our homelands and our countries, sometimes without having been there at all, or not for many years. So we have memories and visions of places, and sometimes we're scared to find out the real truth. But again, I think just an interesting meditation on memory and identity. That's a couple of the resources which can circulate if anybody wants them. And as I said, the Edward Bellamy book is not there, but it's called Looking Backward. I just wanted to touch on a few themes in trying to understand some of this. One theme I think that's interesting out of the New Australia settlement is the paradoxes of identity. So as I said, Leon Cadogan spent his life defending the Paraguayan people, and nevertheless was only there because of really a white Australia policy and a settlement that was explicitly racist. So in what context and how do we measure that contribution, and how would he himself talk about the past? So we've heard how his son describes his Leon's understanding of the past. But while we might say that Cadogan's work lives longer than people will remember William Lane. The former depended on the latter in some ways. That story would never have been written, obviously, unless the New Australia settlement existed. Similarly with Mary Gilmore, who came out as a socialist to Paraguay and was part of this utopian settlement, she became a dame of the British Empire, Dame Mary Gilmore. Her presence on the $10 note in Australia used to have a quote, I think it's gone on the new polymer notes, but used to have a quote on the note from one of her poems, which was "No foe shall gather our harvest." It's a very famous war poem written around the time of the fall of Singapore. And so her legacy is also quite interesting. She's gone through different iterations of identity, from being strongly socialist and leaving Australia to then coming back as a very nationalist identity. But in a way, those things have to be reconciled as well. And one of the things that's interesting is the extent of nationalism that people felt having left their nation. So we had very strong commitments to Australia and fond reminiscences about Australia from people who had left Australia. And it's instructive, I think, that they referred to the settlement as New Australia. They didn't try to erase their history. They were very staunchly nationalist and Australian, despite having actually left the physical country. That reminded me a little bit of Northern Ireland, actually, and that the only place you really see Union Jacks in the UK is all through Belfast and Northern Ireland. So the strength of identity felt is not necessarily linked to the positioning on the land itself, which is, again, obviously a very different conception from, I guess, that Indigenous Australian connection to the land. So how do we perceive the New Australians' connection to Australia in that context? So lots of interesting things, I think, around identity and nationalism within that settlement. The second thing that's interesting really is that history is not remembered. So why is it that Wales cares but Australia doesn't? Why is it that there are hundreds of thousands of pounds being spent to try to continue the Welsh traditions in Patagonia, but no attempts to engage with Paraguay at all? I remember on my travels through Argentina seeing a lot of Australian school tours, private schools normally, I think, but school tours to Buenos Aires and Bariloche, and thinking, I wonder why the Australian students are being taken here rather than Paraguay, which is no further from BA than Bariloche, where there's an actual Australian history to be learnt. Seems interesting that history is forgotten, and I think partly that's because, as I mentioned, maybe it's a story we don't want to hear, and the settlement failed, and it was based around principles that people now rightly object to. But there's also something about Australia not telling its history very well, and this is the point that Don Watson made, the former speechwriter Paul Keating, that Australians are not very good at telling our history. I don't think that's an actual character flaw. That's really about money again. And if you look at how much money, say, the French government spends on the film industry and other governments spend on their cultural industries, the fact that Australia essentially spends very little on its own cultural institutions, and thankfully Whitlam established most of our national cultural institutions in the mid-70s. Before then there was virtually nothing. But even so, we don't spend very much compared to other countries on things like film and literature and plays. So I think the part of the story of this history not being told relates back to our unwillingness or lack of interest, I guess, in telling our own history. I remember reading a few years ago about films in secondary schools in Australia, and the film that was normally shown was Gallipoli, and the second most prominent film was a long way behind, was Rabbit Proof Fence, and then there were virtually no other films that were shown at scale to secondary schools. So those two films were really the dominant stories that Australian children are engaging with. And Gallipoli, of course, is a war story, and Australians are often defined by Gallipoli, and that seems to be the motif of identity, particularly in the last 20 years or so. And the War Memorial's getting another $500 million, so we're spending money on that cultural institution. But other stories that don't tell the story of kind of shared identity, which an exiled story is never going to tell, are not prominent. So does it all matter? Well, I think it does, because I think in some ways it's the obvious point that Cicero made, that you're always a child unless you know your own history. So I think telling this complexity of history is important to Australians, and understanding that history of the 1890s and of what's happened in Paraguay since the settlement went, which wasn't, cannot be considered a complete failure given some of the figures that have come out of it. And then there's probably, related to that, a point that Michael Chandler makes. And Michael Chandler's this brilliant Canadian scholar who wrote a lot about Indigenous cultures, and particularly around things like suicide, where he noted that some Indigenous cultures do have high rates of suicide, but some have almost zero rates of youth suicide in particular. So why is it that you get such differences even within Indigenous cultures? And he talked about continuity, so personal and cultural continuity of identity, which is that notion of both being connected to the past, but also having the autonomy over the future. And I think that's a really important theme as well. And I really encourage you to read some of his work if you can, because he was a lot more eloquent than I'll ever be about. But I think the way that identity is formed, including that connection between past and future, is critical, not only to understanding the past, but in terms of understanding where we're situated in time, and how we can go forward. So this is only a small chapter, obviously, in Australian history, but I think it's an important one. I think it's been neglected, and it would be interesting to hear the thoughts of others on it. So I might stop speaking there, and hopefully we can have a useful discussion. So I'll hand back to you, Freg.
Thanks, Andrew. That was super interesting. We've already got one question come up, so I'll just start off with that one. The question is, what was the main production activity at the colony, and how did they organise the distribution of the benefits? And anyone else who wants to ask a question, just go into the Q&A, which is on the panel down the bottom, and you can put another question in.
So I start with my usual caveat that I'm really not an expert on the settlement. My understanding from what I've read is that they started really as subsistence farmers, and they weren't very good at it. And I think you had the same issue in Wales originally, that people came out really without the skills that were needed to work the land. You had a bunch of idealists and utopians and socialists, but they didn't necessarily understand the land, and the lands where they settled was not particularly conducive, I think, to their farming as well. So they planted crops, they survived on what they grew, and that was mainly what they were trying to do. They were trying to just set up a socialist settlement so that the food was divided equally. In the first few years, it was very much about collective ownership of the land, and it was very much an experiment in how that could work. So I don't think, others may know more, but I don't think they ever got to the point of branching out into industries much beyond that life of subsistence. It was really just an attempt to survive on the land there, and also do quite a bit of writing, which particularly people like Mary Gilmore did at the time as well, to try to capture those thoughts. But it was a self-contained settlement, and that, of course, was part of the purpose of the thing as well, and part of why it failed so quickly, I think, was that it was designed not to mix with the locals. Yeah, others may know more than me, but that was my understanding. It was essentially just a pretty rudimentary socialist settlement.
Thanks. And that question was from Sandra. We've got a question here from Roddy Wood as well. Roddy's question is, are there any intentions of sharing the history the way you have just presented here? Greetings from Paraguay, Andrew. Roddy, great presentation. Thanks for sharing the history of our identity.
Roddy, hello. I wondered if there was going to be a Wood on this call. And I remember that actually Roddy's daughter has written some really interesting work on this. I'm not sure if she ended up coming out or not, Roddy. We can talk offline perhaps, but as far as I know, so I mean, I guess back to the question, in terms of sharing the history, I don't know. I mean, I'd be really interested to talk about how some of this might be able to be progressed. It's always been just a hobby for me. As I said, I have a full-time job that's very much not in this space, but I think it's really interesting. And I was very pleased to be asked to present. And it seems like there's very few people still around who are telling this story. So it is important that we try to keep it going. I'm not sure. So I don't know, really, if you can throw me some suggestions as to how to keep the flame alive. I'd be happy to hear from them, but I'm glad you're well, and I hope your family's well, and thanks for joining the talk. That's great.
Thanks to Roddy. And we have another question here, which is an anonymous one. I think the political economy of the settlement has sparked a lot of people's imagination. This question is, how big were the plots of land for each family?
This is now just trick questions. I don't know. I don't know. I don't even really know. Looking at, I really don't know. But I mean, it's interesting that, as I say, the split came quite early. So I think the tensions were more around things like not being able to mix with the local women, and the gender imbalance was very clear very early on, right? I think there were only about 30 women in the settlement initially, and William Lane had very fixed views about. So William Lane banned Clara, I've forgotten her surname, from being on board the ship after 6 o'clock at night, the Royal Tower, when they came out and everything, because he didn't want a single woman kind of cavorting around the deck. So he had very strict rules around mixing and around single women, and I think that would have been a very major factor in the split from Cosme to New Australia. But the size of the land, I don't know. I confess I've never been to New Australia. That sign is as close as I've got. It's about 11 kilometres from there. I have been to Cosme, but I've never been to New Australia, which is now, of course, New London. Ask Roddy, I guess. Ask somebody with closer knowledge, because I'm not sure. But the subsistence didn't work very well because, as I said, the land, I know, was not particularly, either the land was not particularly fertile, or the settlers, I don't think, were very good at working the land. I think it was probably a bit of both. And they certainly had the same problems in Wales as well, which is why they hiked across the entire country to the foot of the Andes to set up new settlements there. So wasn't unusual for people from so-called advanced Western countries to travel somewhere and discover they actually don't have the skills to survive. That was a pretty common utopian story, I think, of the 1800s. Fordlandia is another one, of course, in the Amazon jungle. So these were common stories of people who didn't really have the skills that they needed when they arrived, but who typically survived one way or another. And of course, they did survive. So it's a story about great hardship, typically in the early years, which then hopefully develops some sustainability, and certainly the Welsh were able to create a more sustainable country.
We've got Roddy's come in response to that question as well, saying that Anne Whitehood and Gavin Salter's, is it Salter or Suter? I've seen the book, but yeah.
Yeah, I think in Australia it's Suter, probably Salter in Paraguay.
Paraguay and Salter explains how the ownership of the land was managed by the settlers. So there might be some more information in there as well. In response to one of those, the question from Sandra about productivity as well, I think there's a researcher from Nuevo Londres called Sonia Uldera who's found some old documents from the old council municipal archives, and some of those show activities like logging and things like that late in the century. So there was maybe a little bit of that going on as well. I had a question, Andrew, about I found that aspect really interesting of the literary interpretations, and some of those literary interpretations back in Australia. So yeah, my question was about that, was about the Louis Nowra play, which I hadn't heard of, but I saw was just then was about the War of the Triple Alliance. And then, yeah, I was just wondering what, if you knew a bit about what kind of inspired Louis Nowra and Gerard Murnane to sort of take an interest in these events.
Yeah, so it's funny because when you talk to people here who are boomers, say, or even kind of silent generation beyond that, so people who are now perhaps getting into their 60s, 70s and 80s, people often tell me that they learnt this story in school. And I think, and I just assume that's the case. I don't know what the national curriculum looked like back then. I'm sure there wasn't any such thing, but a lot of people clearly learnt the story of New Australia because it's not that long ago, I guess. So there are people alive who would have learnt the story in school who have an awareness of it, but most of them are now probably into their 60s, if not older. So that story is being lost because today's students certainly don't learn anything about it. But I suspect there's a reasonably wide knowledge amongst people of that generation of the existence of the settlement. And I certainly know, talking to people just in my own space when I mention it, that people are often, people's parents, for instance, are often, they know it, they know of it. Louis Nowra is an interesting story because he actually studied at La Trobe at my university, and he was studying an arts degree, and he walked out during a lecture about Patrick White's book, The Tree of Man, which is a brilliant book in my view, but which he said was rubbish, and he left the lecture and never came back to his degree, apparently. I ended up driving up the coast from Melbourne to a place called Nowra, which is, I think, on the central coast of New South Wales. Anyway, it might be further up than that, but somewhere up north. And that's how he took his surname. And then created this life as a writer. But interestingly, Patrick White was one of his staunch defenders. So Visions, which is the play that Nowra wrote about Paraguay, which is not really about New Australia. It is just around Eliza Lynch, which is, of course, just sort of made to be written, right? So that play was performed and criticised. I don't think it got a very good response from the critics, and one particular critic pilloried it, and Patrick White took out an ad, I think a half-page ad, defending the play. I'm not sure if he knew, I can't remember the order of this, whether this was before or after Louis Nara had walked out of his course, but Patrick White originally was quite defensive and a supporter of Nara, and then they turned out to have a conflict over various things later in life, but initially, yeah, that play was released, I think in 73, early 70s perhaps. Yeah, Patrick White had to defend it because it didn't get that was one of Nara's first plays, I think. It didn't get that good a reception. I've read it, you can still find it. But as with all plays, you kind of need to see it rather than read it. But again, that's going back a fair way now, right? So I feel like this is one of those stories that's kind of probably dying out a bit as the older generations move on, because it's not taught in schools because we're all just watching Gallipoli. And now rabbit-proof fence as well. And of course, you know, all of this is in the context of the main history that's been erased in Australia, which is Indigenous history. And I remember when we saw the bicentennial celebrations as they were in 1988, I remember seeing a documentary about it, and it was, you know, first the Aboriginal people arrived. Then we start our story. Captain Cook, you know, literally was one sentence. So I think we're only starting to learn in Australia about how to tell our own history and what our history is at a much deeper level than these incidents. But it also reminds you of how much history is linked to education, and if the schools teach it, people will know it. But if it's not in the school system, you're very unlikely to learn it. So this is why we have these culture wars, because they're quite important.
For sure. I think we've got one more question here from Steve Fisher. Thanks for the very interesting presentation. The reasons why Wales gives more attention to its history in Latin America compared to Australia are worth teasing out a little more as a way of understanding how we might encourage more interest in the shared history Australia has with Paraguay. Can you say a little bit more on that, please? So that probably connects into what you were just saying there, but yeah, another chance to expand on that.
Yeah, and I think for Wales, it's a positive story, right? It's a story of settlers who survived hardships of winters and somehow got through, were able to build a railway. They were able to get across to the Andes. There are Welsh chapels all around there. There are Welsh schools. Some of the first Welsh schools were in Patagonia, not in Wales. And some of the first kind of Welsh-speaking formal schools were established in Patagonia. And of course, for the Welsh at the time, it was an opportunity to establish a distinctive identity where they felt they were being, I mean, Wales has always been in the shadow of England. It's a tiny country compared to its English neighbour, but at that time with industrialisation, there were further threats perceived to the Welsh identity, if you like. So again, they're trying to get something purer than they could find in their own kind of adulterated land. So again, the story has those origins around, I guess, probably a fairly one-sided notion of identity. But I think the fact that it succeeded eventually, despite all the hardship, and that it's still there, means that it's a good story for Wales to tell. You know, Wales has always lived in the shadow of this behemoth, and in the last 20 or 30 years, there's been a real resurgence in the Welsh language, despite all odds, really. 500 years of the English trying to kill the Welsh language, and it's survived, and it's come back stronger than ever in the last 20 or so years since devolution. And devolution itself, of course, has given the Welsh an assembly and everything. So there's this sense in Wales that Wales is more European than England, and that it has different focal points of identity. So it has the language, but it also has the nonconformist religion and rugby and coal and history. So I think the settlement in Patagonia is a positive. It's a good news story in Wales. You know, it's a story of identity exported that wasn't, while it was exclusivist. It wasn't based on the same kind of principles as the Australian one. And in fact, one of the reasons why the Welsh settlements survived was that early on they traded and bartered a lot with the indigenous people in Patagonia, which is largely unpopulated apart from indigenous people at that time. So they learnt and they were able to manage intercultural relations much better, I think, than the early Australians, who was explicitly against that idea. So it's a positive story in Wales, and it still has an attraction and a nostalgia, I guess. But also it's got more of a, it's survived more. There's less physical evidence in Australia of the settlement. You have to dig a bit further, and it never got off the ground in the same way. So it's a smaller story, I suppose, but it's also built around traits which we now find, anathema. And this is part of the whole difficulty of reading history as well. People have to judge in their time, of course, but it's uncomfortable for a lot of us to talk about figures, anyone in the 1890s or really even more recently, whose views were quite different from what we would consider acceptable now. So it's a contextual piece of work, I think.
For sure. And I guess that settler colonial context with all these settlements is significant as well, with like you were saying, with the Welsh interacting with indigenous groups in Argentina and arriving there as part of a Argentinian project to expand that colonial frontier too. We're pretty much hitting 11, but we've got two last questions which I'll merge together so you can just answer those as a final statement. The two questions were, how many of the Australian immigrants stayed in Paraguay and how many returned to Australia? And then the other one, that was from Susanna, and the other one was from Giannina. What ideas can we, or Hinanina, what ideas can we discuss to strengthen this history and heritage shared by these two nations?
Yeah, so the first question I don't know. It's a short answer. Anne Whitehead's book would probably have some more detail on it. A lot of people came back. William Lane came back and went to New Zealand, actually, and became quite capitalist. So his own journey was interesting. In fact, his son died of a cricket ball when he was the age of 7 in Australia. So he was never the same after that, I don't think. But he certainly came back, as of course did Mary Gilmore. I guess the fact that there's 2,000 descendants there now, I don't know, maybe there's some mathematical equation you can do, but I honestly don't know how many stayed and how many came back, but my guess would be not many came back. And from what I understand from the quotes I've read recently, a lot of the second generation of settlers had already married local Paraguayans, and a lot of the third generation didn't even know the English language anymore. So I think of those who stayed, they pretty quickly became assimilated, integrated into the broader Paraguayan culture. And maybe that's another reason why there's not much of a fire back in Paraguay to keep the story going. And it goes back to the Cadogan quote about him seeing himself as a true Paraguayan. So I think, I don't have numbers, but it would have been difficult to get back to Australia. Of course, these voyages were very long voyages back then, and they were expensive as well. People like Mary Gilmore had some money, and William Lane obviously had some money from somewhere, but most people wouldn't have had that. And the last question, I don't know. I know, I don't know, but this is a good start, right? I mean, well done, Paraguayan Students Association. And if there's a way of expanding these kind of events or these kind of networks, I'd be happy to help and talk about it. I know people like Roddy are interested in keeping the connections going, so that there are definitely people in both countries who'd be interested in keeping the conversation going. And as with most things, sometimes big things can come out of a small group of people. I'm sure you all know that quote. A small group of people making a difference. But that's true. So I don't have a quick answer, but these kind of forums are great. And I had no idea there were that many Paraguayan students at Melbourne University, so that's really promising start.
Yeah, for sure. And that question as well was directed to everyone. So I think that's something we can keep on working on.
Thank you so much, Andrew and Freg, for this lively conversation. You certainly helped us revisit forgotten history, and it's certainly inspiring to keep exploring this theme further. So thank you for the audience for being, for sharing their comments and questions. We really enjoyed that. I would like to remind everybody that you can rewatch this session on the PSA YouTube channel. We're looking forward to see you all at our next webinar coming up in a few minutes, where Freg will take center stage this time, and he will give us a glimpse of the Hummingbirds Atlas, mapping Guarani history between 1500 and 1820. To attend our next conference, please go straight to the link provided to you via email, or you can still register for it using the link posted on any of our social media platforms. Thank you again, Andrew. Thank you, Freg. And thank you to our lovely audience. And see you soon.
See you soon.
Yeah.